Part 1, The Fortress of Death. The air inside the old fortress was heavy with dust and the scent of sweat and diesel. The walls, stone and cracked from a century of heat and neglect, had seen many wars, yet nothing like this. Qala-i-Jangi, the house of war, stood outside Mazar-i-Sharif like a relic of another age, massive, brooding, and indifferent to whoever ruled Afghanistan that week or that century. In the early morning light, men were herded into the inner courtyard. They had surrendered only days before, foreign volunteers, hardened Taliban, Arabs, Chechens, Pakistanis. Some were barely out of their teens, others veterans of forgotten fronts. They sat with wrists tied, eyes hollow, whispering to one another in a dozen languages. Their surrender had not broken them, it had merely paused the fight. Among them moved two Americans. Mike Spann, square-shouldered and restless, scanned the prisoners with the habit of a man who expected danger at any second. David Tyson, linguist and anthropologist turned CIA officer, stayed close, translating short answers, noting accents, reading the rhythm of fear and defiance that pulsed through the crowd. They had come to identify al-Qaeda operatives and perhaps learn what these men knew about Osama bin Laden's trail. It was November 25, 2001, and the war in Afghanistan was barely 6 weeks old. For a few minutes, the scene looked routine, guards shifting positions, prisoners staring at the ground, a strange calm holding everything together. Then small details began to change, the murmuring grew louder, men straightened, eyes darted toward a particular group at the edge. A single guard stepped away to fetch water. A prisoner adjusted his shawl and whispered something that moved through the rows like an electric signal. Spann noticed first. His voice cut across the courtyard, sharp and certain. He ordered them to stay seated. Tyson turned, trying to separate one phrase from another in a dozen dialects. In that fraction of a second, a man lunged forward. The explosion of motion was instant. Someone grabbed a rifle. The first shots echoed off the walls, and the fortress that had slept under the Afghan sun for 100 years woke to the sound of automatic fire. Spann reacted on instinct, firing back, shouting for Tyson to move. The crowd surged toward him, a wave of bodies driven by rage and desperation. Bullets tore into the air, ricocheting off stone. Outside the gate, Northern Alliance soldiers heard the gunfire but couldn't see the source. Within moments the courtyard became a pit of smoke and screams. Spann fought until his ammunition was gone, then with his sidearm, then with his hands. Tyson managed to break away, sprinting through a passage as the mob closed in behind him. He stumbled into a trench, pressed himself into the dirt, and waited for night. The uprising had begun. By noon, the entire southern compound of Qala-i-Jangi was under rebel control. Prisoners overran armories and dragged weapons from crates. The guards who remained alive fell back toward the outer wall. Some escaped, many did not. The sky above Mazar-i-Sharif darkened with smoke as flames rose from the fortress. What had been a collection of surrendered men only hours earlier was now an army of the condemned. No one outside the walls knew what was happening. Radio contact was broken, the chain of command uncertain. From the distance of a few miles, villagers saw the black column climbing into the blue sky and heard the endless crack of gunfire that rolled across the plain. Inside, Tyson lay silent in his hiding place, counting shots, waiting for rescue. Somewhere behind him, he could still hear Spann's voice echoing in memory, the last American words spoken before the fortress consumed itself. Qala-i-Jangi had lived up to its name. The House of War had awakened again, and its first victim of the new century's war was already dead. Part 2, The World After September 11th. Before the fortress burned, before Afghanistan became a graveyard of empires once again, the world had changed in a single morning. On September 11, 2001, the skyline of New York split apart. Smoke rose over Manhattan, and across oceans, television screens repeated the same images, towers collapsing, people running through clouds of ash, a silence that followed louder than the explosions. The United States, untouched by war on its own soil for generations, felt the shock like a personal wound. In the weeks that followed, grief turned into rage. Across the country, flags appeared on houses, cars, schools. Ordinary lives were measured now by the words before and after. The name al-Qaeda entered daily speech, bin Laden became a face burned into every broadcast. In Washington, the machinery of response moved fast. Intelligence briefings shifted from theory to pursuit. The president promised a global campaign, not against one nation, but against anyone who gave shelter to terror. It was called Operation Enduring Freedom. Its first battlefield would be Afghanistan. Afghanistan, a land already broken by 2 decades of civil war, had become the sanctuary of al-Qaeda. The Taliban ruled most of it, enforcing silence through fear and religious decree. For most Americans, the country was little more than a name in the headlines, remote, mountainous, mysterious. But within its deserts and valleys, the next phase of history waited to be written. Long before official troops landed, the first Americans to enter were not soldiers in uniform. They were members of the CIA's Special Activities Division, small teams who carried money, radios, and questions more than orders. Their job was to find allies and prepare the ground. In October 2001, a handful of men landed on Afghan soil by helicopter, linking up with northern warlords who had been fighting the Taliban for years. Among them was General Abdul Rashid Dostum, a man as feared as he was respected, part warrior, part politician, loyal to no one but victory. The Americans needed him, and he knew it. Through translators and shared enemies, the alliance was born. Northern Alliance forces supplied the manpower, the CIA and U.S. Special Forces provided precision, funding, and the invisible weight of air power overhead. It was a partnership built on necessity, not trust. Each night, fires burned across the plains of northern Afghanistan as the Taliban fell back under relentless bombing. Villages changed hands overnight. Old flags came down, new ones went up. What had seemed impossible in the first days after September 11 now felt inevitable. The Taliban regime was collapsing. By mid-November, Kabul had fallen. Television networks showed Northern Alliance soldiers riding into the city on pickup trucks, beards blowing in the cold air, rifles held high. For a moment, the world saw victory. But even as the capital changed hands, something darker was moving north, a mass of fighters retreating, refusing to surrender, gathering near Kunduz. American intelligence intercepted reports, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Taliban and foreign volunteers cornered near the northern front. Some wanted to negotiate, others swore they would die first. Among them were Arabs, Pakistanis, Chechens, Yemenis, men who had come to Afghanistan not as guests but as believers in holy war. In those final days of November, the U.S. pressed its advantage. Airstrikes continued, and the Northern Alliance surrounded the last pockets of resistance. Columns of prisoners began to move under guard toward Mazar-i-Sharif. Trucks and tractors carried them through a land that smelled of gunpowder and smoke. Some prisoners sang prayers, others stared silently into the dust. They were told they would be questioned, then sent home. Few believed it. Among the CIA officers monitoring their movement were men like Mike Spann and David Tyson. Their orders were simple: identify who among the captives were al-Qaeda and who were local fighters. But even the best intelligence had holes. No one knew that among the hundreds of prisoners marched toward the fortress at Mazar was an American, a quiet young man from California who had changed his name and his faith long before the towers fell. No one yet knew that Qala-i-Jangi would soon be their destination. For now, in late November 2001, it was still called victory. America was winning, the Taliban were broken, and the world believed the war was ending. It was only beginning. Part 3: The Northern Alliance. In the long history of Afghanistan, alliances were as fragile as glass. Empires had marched through and vanished, leaving behind tribes, loyalties, and feuds older than their conquerors. The Northern Alliance was not a single army but a patchwork, different languages, flags, and grudges stitched together by one common enemy, the Taliban. By the late 1990s, the Taliban's black banners had covered most of Afghanistan. In the north, they met the only resistance that could still hold a line. Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Hazaras who refused to kneel fought back from the mountains and valleys around Mazar-i-Sharif, Kunduz, and Takhar. The man who united them, at least in name, was Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir. He was a commander of rare intelligence and discipline, respected even by those who had fought against him. Massoud believed Afghanistan's soul could not survive under extremism. He warned the world of what was coming. In early September 2001, 2 days before the attacks in New York, assassins disguised as journalists entered his camp and detonated a camera rigged with explosives. The Lion of Panjshir was dead. When the towers fell in America, Massoud's men were already leaderless. Yet his death did not destroy the alliance, it hardened it. His lieutenants swore revenge against the Taliban and al-Qaeda, and for the first time, the world was ready to listen. Enter General Abdul Rashid Dostum. Dostum was an Uzbek warlord whose reputation blurred the line between legend and brutality. A man of shifting loyalties, he had fought with communists, then against them, for the government, then against it, for power, always for power. To his enemies, he was a butcher, to his men, a protector. He ruled the plains of northern Afghanistan from Mazar-i-Sharif like a medieval king, riding horses into battle, issuing orders with the confidence of someone who had never truly lost. When the Americans came looking for allies after September 11th, Dostum was waiting. The first meetings between CIA officers and Dostum's commanders took place in hidden camps under cold skies. Maps were spread on carpets. Words were few but direct. The Americans offered weapons, air support, and money. Dostum offered soldiers and local knowledge. Trust was not expected, results were. Together they began the push south. Northern Alliance cavalry, armed with rifles older than the men who carried them, advanced across open plains as U.S. bombers cleared the way ahead. To the world watching on CNN, it looked like a miracle, horsemen charging through clouds of dust while precision bombs fell miles away. But to the men on the ground, it was chaos, confusion, deafening noise, and the taste of iron in the air. In Mazar-i-Sharif, the Taliban garrison resisted longer than expected. The city was sacred and strategic, a crossroads of trade and belief. Every faction wanted it. When it finally fell on November 9, 2001, it was not by diplomacy but by exhaustion. The Taliban retreated or surrendered, leaving behind shattered tanks, burned mosques, and streets filled with silence. The fall of Mazar was the moment when the world realized the Taliban's hold could be broken. It was also the beginning of a new kind of uncertainty. Dostum's forces, flush with victory, rounded up prisoners by the hundreds. Trucks filled with captured fighters rolled through the desert toward the fortress at Qala-i-Jangi, just a few miles west of the city. The fortress had once been Dostum's headquarters, then a Taliban armory, and now, ironically, was being used to hold the very men who had served the regime he had just destroyed. It was an old, massive structure, built of clay and stone, with walls that seemed to remember every drop of blood spilled against them. Inside its labyrinthine halls, time felt suspended, and power shifted with the wind. The Northern Alliance soldiers were exhausted but triumphant. They had watched the Taliban collapse faster than anyone believed possible. They had seen American air power deliver victories in days that once took months. Yet even among their laughter and celebration, there was unease. The prisoners they were guarding were not ordinary men, they were zealots, foreigners who spoke of paradise and martyrdom. They refused food. They prayed endlessly. They stared through their captors as though seeing another world. Dostum himself visited the fortress once in those early days after the fall. He walked the courtyard slowly, speaking to the guards, glancing at the prisoners who knelt in silence. No one could tell what he was thinking. To some, he seemed proud, to others, uneasy. His commanders warned that keeping so many enemy fighters together was dangerous. But where else could they go? The prisons were already overflowing, and winter was coming. And so the captured were kept inside Qala-i-Jangi, watched over by men who had fought too long to believe in peace. Outside, CIA and Special Forces officers came and went, asking questions, taking notes, marking faces. Among them were two names that would soon become forever linked to the fortress, Mike Spann and David Tyson. For a few brief days, northern Afghanistan was calm. The Taliban had been driven out, the Americans were celebrating their first victories, the alliance between the CIA and the warlords seemed to be working. But alliances in Afghanistan have never been built for peace. They are tools for survival, temporary arrangements born from mutual need. And as history would soon show, even allies standing on the same side of a wall could not see what waited behind it. In the shadow of Qala-i-Jangi, the seeds of the next disaster were already sown. Part 4, The Captured Legion. They came in convoys that stretched for miles. Trucks, tractors, pickup beds lined with exhausted men, all heading west toward Mazar-i-Sharif. Some were wounded, some barely conscious. All of them were prisoners. The war that had torn the north was ending for them, not in martyrdom on the battlefield, but in surrender. Northern Alliance soldiers stood on the ridges watching them pass. The prisoners wore layers of torn shawls and dust, the lines of their faces were carved by wind and defeat. Yet there was no sense of relief among them. They did not sing, they did not speak much. Their silence felt heavier than the chains that bound their wrists. The Alliance fighters called them foreigners. They came from Pakistan, Chechnya, Yemen, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, volunteers who had answered the Taliban's call years earlier. They had crossed borders to defend what they believed was holy ground. For them, defeat was not dishonor but prophecy fulfilled. The next world mattered more than this one. Among their number were Arabs who had trained in al-Qaeda camps near Kandahar, men who had met Osama bin Laden himself. A few were survivors of earlier wars, veterans of Bosnia, of Chechnya, of forgotten jihadist fronts scattered through the 1990s. They had fought all their lives, and losing did not teach them surrender. When the battle for Kunduz ended in late November 2001, nearly 1,000 Taliban and foreign fighters laid down their weapons under promise of safe passage. The promise was thin. No one trusted it. Rumors spread quickly, some prisoners had been executed along the road, others disappeared. Yet still they marched or rode toward Mazar-i-Sharif because there was nowhere else to go. The winter wind cut through the open trucks as the convoy neared its destination. From a distance, the city shimmered in pale light, scarred by weeks of bombing. Beyond it, rising from the flat plain, stood the outline of a fortress, high walls, square towers, ancient and grim. Its name was Qala-i-Jangi. For most of the prisoners, it was just another place to be confined. They did not know its history, how the British had once fought there, how it had served kings, warlords, and armies before them. But the men who guarded it knew. They whispered that the fortress was cursed, that blood never left its soil once spilled. As the first trucks entered the gate, the Northern Alliance soldiers shouted orders, herding the prisoners into the southern courtyard. The dust rose around them like smoke. They were told to sit in rows, to keep their heads down, to wait. The guards were nervous. Many of them had lost brothers to the Taliban, and the sight of these captured fighters stirred old anger. Interpreters moved among the rows, demanding names and nationalities. Some prisoners complied in broken Dari or Arabic, others refused to speak at all. Their silence was deliberate, a weapon of defiance. Inside the fortress, the atmosphere was taut. The Alliance soldiers had expected gratitude or fear, instead they faced calm indifference. The prisoners behaved as if captivity were only a pause before something else, something unseen. Over the next 2 days, more groups arrived. The courtyard filled with hundreds of men pressed shoulder to shoulder. The Alliance guards began to separate them, the Afghans in one section, the foreigners in another. Food was scarce, water scarcer. Each night the temperature dropped below freezing. Fires burned in barrels along the walls, their glow throwing shadows that made the prisoners' faces look hollow, almost spectral. Rumors ran through the fortress like wind through a broken door. Some said the prisoners planned to rise up. Others said they would be executed at dawn. Both possibilities felt true. Guards doubled shifts. Commanders argued over what to do with the captives. There were too many to move, too dangerous to release, and too unpredictable to ignore. Among the prisoners was a young man who did not fit. His beard was thin, his eyes pale, his accent strange. He spoke little and when he did, it was in halting Arabic. His companions called him Yunus. None of the guards recognized him as anything unusual. In time the world would learn his real name, John Walker Lind, born in California, a convert to Islam who had joined the Taliban months before the attacks on America. But in the final days of November 2001, he was just another captive among hundreds, waiting for fate to decide his usefulness or his death. Outside the fortress, the Northern Alliance commanders debated with their American counterparts. The CIA wanted access to the prisoners for questioning who they were, where they trained, what they knew of al-Qaeda's structure. General Dostum's officers wanted them gone, afraid that so many enemies in one place could turn the city into chaos again. But no other prison could hold them. Qala-i-Jangi was the only option. By the time the CIA team received permission to enter, the tension inside had grown visible. Prisoners whispered prayers in unison. Some guards reported seeing them motion with their hands as if mapping the walls, counting paces, studying routes of escape. Whether true or imagined, fear spread quickly through the ranks of those assigned to watch them. In those days before the uprising, the fortress was a place of waiting, too quiet, too crowded, too charged with unfinished war. Dust hung in the air like fog, coating skin and breath. Each man inside felt it, something was about to happen. The Northern Alliance soldiers clutched their rifles tighter. The prisoners kept whispering their verses. And in the center of the courtyard, under the watch of an ancient Afghan sky, the captured legion dreamed not of freedom but of vengeance. Part 5, The CIA arrives. Morning broke cold and thin over Mazar-i-Sharif. The sky was the color of smoke, and the wind carried the dust of old battles. Inside Qala-i-Jangi, the prisoners were already awake, sitting motionless in their lines. They did not speak. Their eyes followed the guards with slow, unreadable attention. At the main gate, a convoy of vehicles rolled in, raising clouds from the dry earth. The soldiers at the checkpoint straightened their backs. They had been told Americans were coming, not soldiers, but intelligence men. No one knew quite what that meant, only that they were different. Two men stepped out of the first vehicle. They carried themselves with the quiet alertness of those who had seen too much in too little time. The first, broad-shouldered, his jaw set like iron, wore a baseball cap pulled low against the light. His name was Mike Spann, a CIA paramilitary officer. The second, leaner, with the stillness of a listener, was Dave Tyson, a linguist and intelligence specialist who spoke fluent Uzbek. They had been sent by the CIA's Special Activities Division, the first Americans to enter the fortress. Spann surveyed the courtyard. The prisoners sat like stones, hundreds of them. Some looked up briefly, their expressions flat, unreadable. Others ignored the newcomers entirely, lost in their own exhaustion or prayer. Tyson began speaking with the local commanders, his voice calm, almost polite. He asked about the prisoners, who they were, where they came from, who commanded them. The answers were vague. The alliance officers shrugged, pointing at the groups and muttering, Taliban, Arabs, foreigners. Few knew which ones belonged to al-Qaeda. Spann's gaze moved across the courtyard, pausing on faces that didn't look Afghan, narrow eyes, lighter skin, foreign beards. He knew these were the men they had come for. The CIA team's orders were simple but impossible: find out who among the prisoners had information about Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda's networks. The war was far from over. Every name, every hint, could be a clue leading to the next strike. But inside the fortress, knowledge and danger were one and the same. They began questioning prisoners one by one, pulling men from the rows. Tyson translated as Spann asked sharp, direct questions: names, countries, training camps. Some prisoners pretended not to understand. Others gave half answers, deflecting or lying outright. There was fear behind their silence, but also something else: discipline. One prisoner, a tall Arab with a scar across his cheek, stared straight at Spann and said softly, "You will die here." Tyson caught the words, hesitated, and translated them flatly. Spann's expression didn't change. He stepped closer, his voice steady. "Maybe. But you'll tell me what I need first." The day passed slowly. The sun climbed high, turning the air in the courtyard heavy and dry. The guards shifted restlessly, uneasy under the prisoners' watchful eyes. More men were questioned. Most said nothing useful. Some refused to speak at all. Spann's patience began to thin. He had fought his way into Afghanistan only weeks earlier, working alongside the Northern Alliance to bring down the Taliban. He was a Marine before he was a spy, decisive, direct, intolerant of delay. By late afternoon, Spann and Tyson moved toward a group of foreigners sitting slightly apart from the others. They looked younger, many barely in their 20s. One of them caught Spann's attention, and thin, bearded, his clothes dirty but not torn. His face was pale beneath the grime. Spann crouched in front of him. "Where are you from?" he asked. No answer. Tyson repeated the question in Arabic. The man looked down, silent. "Are you American?" Spann pressed. Still no answer. Tyson leaned closer, switching to another dialect. At last, the prisoner spoke a few quiet words. His accent was strange, not Afghan, not Arab. Tyson frowned. Something about it felt familiar. He asked again, softer this time. The prisoner replied with halting Arabic, his voice trembling. Tyson's eyes narrowed. He recognized the accent as Western, unmistakably so. He turned to Spann and murmured, "I think he's American." For a moment Spann didn't react. Then he looked back at the prisoner, studying him. "You're from the US?" he asked. Silence again, but a flicker of recognition passed through the man's eyes. It was John Walker Lind, though no one yet knew his name. An American who had come to Afghanistan long before the towers fell, drawn by faith and ideology into the Taliban's war. Spann's tone hardened. "Why are you here? Why fight for them?" he demanded. Tyson translated. The prisoner said nothing. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground. Around them, the other captives began to stir, murmuring in low voices. The air thickened with tension. Spann straightened, scanning the courtyard. He sensed something shifting. The stillness that had hung over the fortress for days was gone, replaced by an unease that ran beneath the surface like fire under ash. Tyson noticed it too, the prisoners whispering to one another, the quick glances, the way hands moved beneath shawls as if reaching for something hidden. The alliance guards grew nervous. One shouted at the prisoners to stay still. Another cocked his rifle. Spann raised a hand to calm them, but his instincts were alert now. He turned to Tyson. "We should move," he said quietly. Tyson nodded. As they stepped away, a distant shout echoed from the far side of the courtyard. Then another. A ripple of motion spread through the prisoners. Someone stood up. Another followed. Spann stopped, turning sharply. "What's happening?" he called out. Tyson didn't answer, he was already backing toward the nearest wall, scanning for cover. Within seconds, the calm shattered. A prisoner lunged at a guard, wresting away his rifle. Another pulled a hidden grenade from beneath his tunic. Spann's hand went to his weapon. Tyson shouted something, a warning, lost in the roar of the first explosion. The uprising had begun. Part 6, The Uprising Ignites. The explosion tore through the courtyard like thunder trapped within stone walls. For an instant, time fractured, dust, screams, and shrapnel filled the air. The guards closest to the blast fell without a sound. The rest scattered, shouting orders, firing wildly into the chaos. Mike Spann was already moving. Years of training took over, instincts faster than thought. He ducked behind a low wall, drawing his sidearm, scanning for Tyson. "Dave," he shouted. The name vanished in the noise. Across the courtyard, the prisoners surged as one. Hundreds of them rose from the ground in a wave of motion, breaking their lines, charging at the guards. It was not confusion, it was purpose, long rehearsed in silence. They struck with anything they could find, rocks, stolen rifles, bare hands, even teeth. The fortress that had been silent for days now pulsed with the roar of men who had chosen death over captivity. The Northern Alliance guards tried to form a line, but panic spread faster than orders. Some fled toward the gate, others fired into the mass of prisoners. The bullets tore through bodies, but the attackers did not stop. They were beyond fear, beyond reason. Spann fired until his magazine was empty. He hit men at 10 meters, 5 meters, 1 meter. Still they came. He drew his second weapon, shouting at the approaching crowd to stop, to back down. They did not. A man lunged toward him, eyes blazing, a grenade clutched in one hand. Span shot him point blank, but the grenade rolled free. He dove aside as it detonated, the blast slamming him into the ground. His ears rang, the world spinning. He forced himself up, stumbling toward a broken wall for cover. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Tyson, pinned near a staircase, returning fire with his AK. Tyson's face was streaked with dust, his voice hoarse as he shouted orders to nearby guards who no longer listened. The uprising spread like fire through dry grass. Prisoners stormed the northern end of the courtyard, overpowering guards, seizing weapons, rushing the armory where boxes of ammunition lay stacked. Every gun captured turned against its former owner. From the fortress towers, Alliance fighters rained bullets down into the melee, but it made little difference. The rebels had no formation, no leader, just fury. Their chants rose in unison, echoing off the walls, words lost but meaning unmistakable, martyrdom. In the confusion, Tyson managed to reach the doorway of the southern barracks, dragging a wounded soldier with him. He looked back once, searching for Span. The courtyard was a sea of movement, indistinguishable shapes lost in smoke. Span was still fighting. Witnesses later said they saw him standing alone near the well in the center of the yard, firing at attackers from both sides. He shouted at them in English, perhaps warning, perhaps cursing. No one could hear his words. A prisoner leapt onto his back, Span threw him off and kept firing. Then another came, and another. The swarm engulfed him. Tyson saw it happen from across the courtyard. For an instant, he froze, disbelief breaking through the adrenaline. Then he turned and ran, pushing deeper into the fortress, into shadowed hallways that led toward the command post. Behind him, the gunfire grew fainter, replaced by the steady rhythm of chants and explosions. Outside the fortress, the city of Mazar-i-Sharif heard the echo before understanding the cause. Civilians peered from doorways as columns of smoke rose from Qala-i-Jangi. Dostum's officers scrambled for vehicles, shouting into radios that the prisoners had revolted. No one believed it at first. How could a few hundred captives challenge an army? But within minutes, the truth became impossible to deny. Back inside, Tyson barricaded himself with several Northern Alliance fighters in a storage room beneath the courtyard. The air was thick with dust and fear. Through the cracks in the wooden door, he could see flickers of firelight as rebels moved through the halls above. He could hear them shouting to each other in Arabic and Pashto. They were searching room by room, killing any guard they found. Tyson checked his ammunition, a half-full magazine, nothing more. He knew Span was gone. He also knew if he stayed here, he'd soon join him. Yet outside, the fortress had become a labyrinth of death. Every corner held enemies. Hours passed like minutes. Night fell, bringing silence broken only by sporadic bursts of gunfire. The rebels had taken the southern courtyard completely, arming themselves with captured weapons, grenades, and even RPGs. They had no escape, but they didn't need one, they meant to die fighting. In the northern section of the fortress, Alliance commanders gathered nervously. They had lost control of half their stronghold. Radios crackled with confused reports, hundreds of dead, dozens missing, the Americans trapped inside. One commander demanded air support, but communication with U.S. forces was slow, uncertain. No one outside the fortress could see clearly what was happening within its walls. As midnight approached, the fortress fell eerily quiet. The wind carried the smell of blood and gunpowder. Fires burned unchecked, lighting the sky with dull orange glow. Tyson sat in the dark, listening. Every creak sounded like a footstep. Every whisper of wind could be a breath behind the door. He thought of Span, his last shout, the look on his face, the chaos that swallowed him. For the first time since the war began, Tyson felt something he had trained to suppress, helplessness. Somewhere above him, in the open yard, the rebels prayed aloud. They believed their uprising was victory enough, that dying here would open the gates of paradise. And in that moment, Qala-i-Jangi ceased to be a prison or a battlefield. It became a tomb, one that would not be silent again for days. Part 7, Night in the Fortress. Darkness came slowly, settling over Qala-i-Jangi like a heavy shroud. The smoke from burning oil drums drifted above the ramparts, staining the stars. The fortress that had stood silent for centuries now groaned under the weight of bodies, fire, and the echoes of dying men. In the southern courtyard, the uprising had claimed its ground. Hundreds of rebels, once prisoners, now controlled the heart of the fortress. They moved through the rubble like phantoms, looting weapons, dragging ammunition crates, tending to their wounded in the faint orange light. Their victory was bitter and incomplete. They had no escape, no reinforcements, no way to survive beyond the walls. Yet none of them spoke of surrender. In the northern wing, the Northern Alliance regrouped. Reinforcements had arrived from Mazar-i-Sharif, men loyal to General Dostum, armed and furious. They took positions on the walls and towers, wary of the dark figures moving below. Every few minutes, a burst of gunfire shattered the silence, answered by the flash of tracer rounds cutting across the courtyard. Between these two worlds, the trapped and the vengeful, was one man still alive against all odds. Dave Tyson crouched in the cellar beneath the fortress, his back pressed to the cold wall. The air was thick with dust and the smell of smoke. Around him lay 3 wounded Alliance fighters, one barely breathing. They whispered prayers, their voices trembling. Tyson's mind moved with mechanical focus. Every instinct told him to stay silent, conserve strength, wait for dawn. Yet the fortress above was restless as footsteps, shouting, metal striking stone. The rebels were searching every passage. He gripped his AK tightly. The magazine was half empty. His throat burned from smoke and thirst. He had not eaten since morning. But hunger and fear had become distant sensations. Only survival remained. At intervals, he closed his eyes, replaying the day's chaos. Span's last stand near the well. The eruption of grenades. The moment the courtyard transformed from a prison into a battlefield. It replayed with merciless clarity. He tried to push it away, but the memory returned like a tide. Above him, muffled voices echoed, Arabic, then Pashto. The sound of boots scuffing stone. Tyson held his breath. A light flickered under the door, the glow of a burning torch. Someone shouted. Then footsteps moved away. He exhaled slowly, his pulse still hammering. Outside, in the open yard, the rebels gathered their dead into rough rows. They chanted prayers, their voices low and resonant. Among them, the young American, John Walker Lind, sat against a wall, silent. He was bruised, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, his eyes vacant. He had not fought like the others, he had simply survived. The men around him treated him with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Through the night, bursts of gunfire flared from the towers. The Northern Alliance kept up sporadic fire, testing enemy positions, afraid to advance in the dark. A few men attempted it, climbing down from the walls to throw grenades into the courtyard, but most did not return. The rebels were waiting for them. By midnight, the fortress was divided, north against south, shadow against fire. The courtyard between them was a graveyard. The air stank of cordite and blood. In the city beyond, word of the uprising spread through Mazar-i-Sharif. Civilians locked their doors. The sound of distant explosions rolled across the rooftops. At Dostum's command post, officers argued over how to retake the fortress without destroying it entirely. Some urged immediate bombardment. Others warned that American intelligence agents were still trapped inside. But no one knew if Tyson was alive. Inside his hiding place, Tyson checked his radio again, dead. The batteries had drained hours earlier. He had no way to call for help, no way to tell his comrades he was still breathing. He thought of home, of quiet suburbs, of people who could never imagine this place, this night. He thought of Span, whose last act had been to fight alone so Tyson could escape. That thought anchored him, gave him purpose. He would not die here. Hours dragged by. The temperature dropped. The wounded Alliance soldier beside him stopped breathing sometime before dawn. Tyson didn't move the body. There was no point. When light began to creep through the cracks in the ceiling, it revealed the devastation left behind: broken masonry, scattered weapons, blood staining the walls. The fortress seemed to sigh with the memory of the night. From outside came a new sound: engines. Vehicles approaching. Tyson listened, straining to catch words amid the wind. A voice shouted in Uzbek. Another answered in English. He froze. Then slowly, cautiously, he rose to his feet. The nightmare of the night had ended, but the battle for the fortress was far from over. Above him, on the walls of Qala-i-Jangi, the banners of the Northern Alliance stirred in the cold morning air. The rebels still held the courtyard, but now, from the North Gate, the Americans were returning, and they were bringing air power with them. The second day of the uprising was about to begin. Part 8: Fire from the Sky. The sun rose pale and weak over Mazar-i-Sharif. A thin fog clung to the plain, wrapping the fortress of Qala-i-Jangi in ghostly light. From a distance, it looked calm again, the great stone walls standing silent, unmoved by the chaos within. Only the smoke that drifted upward betrayed the truth. Inside those walls, the uprising still smoldered. The southern courtyard, once the prisoners' cage, was now their battleground. The rebels held their ground among burned trucks and shattered crates, armed with rifles, grenades, and the determination of men who expected to die before sunset. From the towers of the northern wall, the Northern Alliance watched them through scopes. The Alliance commander barked orders in Uzbek, his voice raw from shouting through the night. His men were exhausted, their eyes rimmed with red. They had lost friends in the first wave and wanted vengeance. But every time they tried to advance, gunfire from below cut them down. The fortress had become a trap for both sides. Shortly after sunrise, the first American convoy appeared at the edge of the city. Dust swirled behind the vehicles as they approached, marked by the unmistakable shape of U.S. Special Forces Humvees. With them came CIA personnel, translators, and Afghan liaisons. They had come not only to retake the fortress, but to find out what had happened to the men they'd sent inside. By the time the Americans reached Qala-i-Jangi's outer gate, the stench of gunpowder and death filled the air. The Alliance soldiers guarding the entrance saluted quickly, their eyes darting toward the smoke rising from within. They spoke all at once, pointing toward the inner courtyard, shouting in Uzbek and Dari. Only one word came through clearly again and again: Arab, Arab, Arab. The Americans understood enough. The Arabs meant al-Qaeda. A communications unit set up near the north wall. Through binoculars, a special forces captain surveyed the interior. He saw bodies scattered across the open yard, smoke curling from the southern end where the rebels had barricaded themselves in the armory. He also saw movement, men darting between broken walls, carrying ammunition boxes. He turned to his team. "They've got the ammo stores," he said flatly. "We can't take that courtyard without air." The decision came fast. Calls went up the chain. Coordinates were relayed. Minutes later, the sound of approaching aircraft rolled across the sky like distant thunder. Tyson, still hidden in the northern cellars, heard it too. The low hum that built into a roar. For the first time since the uprising began, hope flickered. He didn't know whether the planes would save him or bury him, but he knew they meant someone outside was listening. In the courtyard, the rebels looked up. Some shouted defiance. Others simply knelt and began to pray. They had fought all night, expecting death to come by rifle or grenade. Now it would come from the heavens. The first strike hit just after noon. A blinding flash, then the ground convulsed. The shockwave rolled through the fortress, shattering windows, lifting dust in a massive column. The armory erupted in flame. The sound was beyond comprehension, the ancient walls groaned as though the earth itself had screamed. For a moment, everything disappeared in smoke and dust. Then came the second strike, and the third. The Americans called them in with precision, targeting the southern buildings where the rebels were entrenched. The Northern Alliance fighters on the walls cheered with each impact, their rage finding its outlet in the destruction below. When the dust began to settle, the southern yard looked like a wasteland. Fire licked through broken beams and melted metal. Craters marred the ground where the armory had stood. Yet somehow, impossibly, gunfire still crackled from the ruins. The rebels were not done. From beneath the collapsed structures, survivors emerged, blackened by soot, coughing, but still carrying weapons. They stumbled forward, shouting verses and firing blindly at the walls above. Their defiance was terrible to witness. They no longer fought to win, only to be remembered. The Americans watched through scopes, grim-faced. "They're still alive down there," one said quietly. The commander nodded. "Then we keep hitting them." More strikes followed through the afternoon. The fortress trembled with every blast. Inside the cellars, Tyson braced himself as chunks of ceiling fell around him. The air grew hot and unbreathable. He pressed his face into his sleeve and waited, every muscle tight, wondering if the next detonation would bring the roof down. By evening, the bombardment eased. The sky turned copper red, and the fires within the fortress burned like torches. Smoke drifted over the city, thick and acrid. When the noise finally stopped, an eerie silence returned. No one dared move for a while, not the rebels, not the Alliance fighters, not the Americans outside. The only sounds were crackling flames and the groans of the dying. Then, slowly, movement began again. Alliance troops descended cautiously into the yard, stepping over debris, rifles raised. They expected resistance. What they found instead were shattered walls and scattered bodies. A few rebels still clung to life, firing from the shadows, but their shots were weak, directionless. As night approached, the Americans called off the advance. The fortress was still too unstable, too dangerous. They would wait until morning to clear it. Tyson, buried deep in the labyrinth of stone corridors, felt the tremors fade. He pushed aside the rubble blocking his door and crawled toward a shaft of dim light. When he finally emerged, the world above him looked nothing like the one he had entered 2 days earlier. The southern courtyard was a crater of ruin. Smoke curled from blackened walls. The stench of burning fuel hung thick in the air. He climbed to a ledge and stared across the devastation. There was no sign of life, no prisoners moving, no shouts. Just silence, and the endless drift of ash. Somewhere out there, he knew, lay Mike Spann's body. He whispered the name once, under his breath, then turned toward the sound of distant voices. Help had finally arrived, but the battle for Qala-i-Jangi was not finished. Deep beneath the wreckage, in tunnels and cellars untouched by the bombs, some of the rebels still lived. And by morning, they would fight again. Part 9, The Tunnels of Death. The morning after the bombardment came cold and gray. The fog was thicker than ever, rolling in from the desert like a curtain drawn across the battlefield. Qala-i-Jangi lay broken beneath it, the ancient walls cracked and blackened, the courtyards filled with ash and twisted metal. For a few moments, there was silence. No gunfire, no shouting. Only the soft, hollow sound of the wind through ruined arches. It might have seemed, to anyone looking from afar, that the uprising was finally over. But beneath the surface, the fortress was alive. Hidden below the shattered armory, in tunnels and storage vaults that ran deep under the southern yard, a handful of Taliban fighters still breathed. The night's bombardment had sealed most of the exits, trapping them underground, yet somehow, it had also saved them. The thick earth and stone had absorbed the blasts, sparing those who had taken refuge below before the first bombs fell. Now, they crouched in the dark, surrounded by smoke and debris, whispering prayers in the stale air. Their ammunition was nearly gone, their food long finished, but they still had grenades, still had their faith, and still had hatred enough to burn. Among them was the young foreign fighter Tyson had seen days before, a thin, intense man with dark eyes that reflected no fear. He was wounded now, his arm bound with a strip of cloth, but he refused to rest. "We are still alive," he told the others. "Then the fight is not over." Above ground, U.S. Special Forces and Northern Alliance troops gathered near the fortress gates. The air still smelled of gunpowder and smoke. The Americans moved carefully, checking corners, stepping over broken weapons and the remains of burned-out trucks. The destruction was staggering, even veterans of Afghanistan's long wars had rarely seen such concentrated fury. A Special Forces sergeant knelt beside a crater. "That was the armory," he murmured. Looks like it went straight to hell. His captain nodded grimly. If there's anyone left alive down there, they'll be cornered. That was the problem, down there. Qala-i-Jangi had been built centuries ago by warlords who expected sieges. Beneath its courtyards were labyrinths, tunnels, cellars, chambers where supplies and horses were once kept. Over the decades, the passages had been expanded, forgotten, rediscovered. They formed a maze even locals barely understood. Now, that maze had become a tomb, or a hiding place. By mid-morning, a small team was chosen to enter. American and Alliance troops advanced cautiously into the southern courtyard, rifles raised, stepping through the rubble. The fires had mostly burned out, leaving blackened walls and pools of water from the night's rain. Steam rose from the craters like breath from a wounded beast. The first tunnel entrance was found beneath a pile of bricks. It was narrow, barely wide enough for one man to crawl through. The air that came out was hot and foul. Whoever's down there, one soldier muttered, they've been breathing smoke for hours. The captain gave the order. Flashlights on. Slow and steady. One by one, they dropped into the darkness. The passage twisted and turned, the walls slick with soot and condensation. Every step echoed. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, until even the sound of their own breathing felt intrusive. Halfway down the tunnel, they found the first body. A Taliban fighter, burned and half buried in debris. His rifle lay beside him, jammed with dust. The soldiers stepped around him carefully and moved on. At the next junction, the team split. One group continued straight, the other turned left toward what they believed was the armory's lower level. That was when the first grenade rolled out of the dark. The explosion ripped through the passage, throwing men backward, filling the tunnel with dust and screams. The flashlights flickered. One soldier shouted for a medic, but the narrow space made it impossible to move quickly. Gunfire followed, deafening in the confined space. The Americans returned fire, but they couldn't see their enemy clearly. Shadows darted between the beams of light, shouting in Arabic, firing, vanishing again. Above ground, the sound of explosions echoed faintly through the courtyard. The officers listening on the radio heard only fragments, shouts, static, then silence. When the surviving men crawled back into daylight, their faces were pale, their uniforms streaked with dust and blood. One of them looked at the captain and simply said, "They're dug in deep. We can't reach them without clearing the tunnels." By afternoon, heavy machinery arrived, bulldozers, excavators. The plan was brutal but necessary, seal the tunnels one by one, leaving only a few entry points where tear gas and water could be pumped in. The rebels would have to come out, or suffocate. As the work began, Tyson watched from a distance. He had been pulled from the ruins that morning, dehydrated and disoriented, but alive. The Americans had greeted him like a ghost returned from the dead. He told them what he knew, about the prisoners, the uprising, the chaos in the courtyard. When they asked how he'd survived, he only shrugged. "I kept moving," he said. Now, he stood near the northern wall, arms folded, eyes on the machines tearing into the earth. Part of him pitied the men still trapped below. The other part, the part hardened by the past 2 days, felt nothing at all. By evening, water began to flow into the lower tunnels. The sound was eerie, a deep, echoing rush that grew louder with every minute. The men underground must have heard it too, must have known what it meant. For hours, nothing happened. Then, as night fell, the first survivors appeared. They emerged coughing and gasping, their hands raised, their faces gray with ash. Some collapsed immediately, unable to stand. Others still clutched their weapons, but dropped them as they saw the soldiers surrounding them. Among the last to come out was the young foreign fighter, the one with the dark eyes. He looked thin, almost ghost-like, his lips cracked, his body trembling. Yet his gaze was steady. When a soldier shouted at him to kneel, he obeyed, slowly, as though he were bowing to something greater than the men around him. The uprising of Qala-i-Jangi was over. But as the captives were led away under floodlights, Tyson couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the battle inside the fortress was just the first tremor of something far larger waiting beyond Afghanistan's borders. And in that cold, smoke-stained dawn, he understood, the war they had unleashed here would not stay confined to this land of dust and ruins. It would follow them all home. Part 10: The Aftermath and the Secret Debrief. By the time the sun lifted over Qala-i-Jangi again, the smoke had begun to thin. The fortress that had once stood proud against the plains now looked hollowed out, like the skull of a great beast picked clean by time. Soldiers moved slowly through the rubble, marking bodies, gathering weapons, photographing everything. The battle was finished, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the gunfire that had filled the days before. Tyson sat on an ammunition crate near the northern wall, sipping tepid water from a plastic bottle. His hands still trembled. Every sound, a shovel striking rock, a radio crackling, made him flinch. He had lived through 2 nights of chaos, and now the quiet pressed on him like weight. Across the courtyard, rows of captured fighters knelt under guard. Their clothes were torn, faces streaked with soot. A few muttered prayers, others stared blankly at the ground. They were no longer the defiant men who had seized the armory. They were ghosts, half alive, waiting for a judgment no one wanted to pronounce. The Northern Alliance commander stalked among them, barking orders, counting survivors. Out of more than 400 prisoners brought into the fortress days earlier, fewer than 100 still breathed. The rest lay scattered through the tunnels and courtyards, buried by their own rebellion. Near midday, an American helicopter thumped in from the west, kicking up dust and loose ash. Out stepped intelligence officers, grim, quiet men in plain uniforms without insignia. They spoke briefly with the field captain, then turned their attention to the prisoners. Questions began immediately: names, countries, affiliations. Some fighters answered in English or Arabic, others kept silent. When the interrogators realized how many foreign accents filled the air, Chechen, Yemeni, Pakistani, Saudi, they exchanged dark glances. This wasn't merely a pocket of Taliban holdouts. These were the remnants of something broader, something global. By dusk, Tyson was summoned to a tent pitched just outside the fortress gate. Inside, the light was dim, the air thick with the smell of fuel and sweat. A colonel sat behind a folding table, his expression unreadable. Another man stood beside him, a civilian with the posture of someone used to authority. His badge identified him only as agency. Tyson saluted out of habit. "Sit down," the colonel said. "We need everything you remember. Start from the beginning." For the next 2 hours Tyson spoke. He described the arrival of the prisoners, the uneasy calm that had preceded the explosion of violence, the moment Mike Spann was attacked, and the chaos that followed. He spoke of the armory, of the fire, of the tunnels that seemed to breathe death. The words came haltingly at first, then faster, like water breaking through a dam. When he finished, the room was silent. The civilian leaned forward, hands clasped. Did any of the prisoners mention where they'd come from before Mazar? Tyson thought back. Some spoke about Kunduz. Others said Kandahar. One of them, an Arab kid, talked about training near Jalalabad. He mentioned a guest house. The man nodded slowly. Al-Qaeda safe house, he murmured, jotting notes. We'll need you to review some photos later. The colonel dismissed Tyson with a brief nod. Get some rest, son. You've done enough. Outside, the wind had risen again, carrying the faint smell of smoke over the city. Tyson looked back at the fortress one last time. From a distance, the fires inside looked almost beautiful, orange light flickering through broken arches, the last traces of a battle that had already begun to fade into rumor. Yet even as he turned away, a part of him knew it wasn't finished. There were still bodies to recover, still questions that would never be answered. And somewhere among the captured fighters, hidden behind blank eyes, were men who carried secrets far beyond Afghanistan, names, routes, codes, connections that would soon shape wars yet to come. That night, as reports flew back to headquarters, the name Qala-i-Jangi appeared in encrypted cables for the first time. It would become shorthand among intelligence circles, a warning about what happened when the enemy refused to die quietly. In Washington, the information landed on desks already drowning in chaos. Analysts scanned the early summaries and felt the familiar chill of recognition. The uprising wasn't just an isolated incident, it was proof that the network they hunted was deeper, more organized, and far more willing to die than anyone had imagined. Back in Mazar-i-Sharif, the fortress settled into uneasy quiet. Bulldozers filled the last open pits, sealing the tunnels where the final rebels had fallen. The call to prayer drifted faintly over the city as night took hold again. Tyson lay on a cot in a makeshift barack, staring at the canvas roof. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the flashes again, the red sky, the walls collapsing, the faces of men who'd chosen fire over surrender. He didn't know yet that in a few days, the world would hear whispers of the prison uprising, though most would never learn what really happened inside those walls. He only knew that the war had changed shape. It had stepped out of the mountains and into the labyrinth of politics, intelligence, and vengeance. And the fortress of Qala-i-Jangi, with its charred stones and buried secrets, had become its first monument. End of Part 10. Is almost equal to 1/400 words, can be expanded to 3/500 plus by adding interrogation scenes, strategic debates in Kabul and Washington, and Tyson's psychological aftermath. Would you like me to continue with Part 11, The Chain Reaction, where the intelligence from Qala-i-Jangi begins linking the uprising to international terror networks and sets off new covert missions? Part 11, The Chain Reaction. The day after the debrief, the fortress of Qala-i-Jangi lay quiet, its walls still smoking, its courtyards littered with ash and shattered weapons. Yet even as soldiers and analysts catalogued the aftermath, far beyond Mazar-i-Sharif, the consequences of the uprising began to ripple outward like waves across a dark pond. In Kabul, analysts pored over intelligence cables from the previous days. Reports from the field were grim, hundreds of prisoners dead, dozens more captured, and critical pieces of information potentially lost forever. One cable stood out as details of the foreign fighters, their movements, their training camps, their alleged contacts abroad. Names scribbled in Arabic, Pashto, and broken English hinted at a network far more expansive than anyone had anticipated. The CIA convened a special session in a dimly lit office near the embassy. Men and women in civilian clothing, some in tactical gear, crowded around a long table cluttered with maps, photos, and documents recovered from Qala-i-Jangi. Intelligence analysts traced lines from Mazar-i-Sharif to Kandahar, Jalalabad, and beyond, linking the captured fighters to training camps in Pakistan, safe houses in the Middle East, and financiers in Europe. A linguist from the field translated a note found in a foreign fighter's pocket. It was a single word, written in a shaky hand: bait, house, home, base. But in context, analysts knew it referred to the network's safe house system, the shadow infrastructure that made the insurgency resilient. Tyson, now flown to Kabul for further debriefings, sat quietly in the corner, replaying the past days in his mind. The memory of Mike Spann's last stand haunted him. The explosion of gunfire, the chaos of the tunnels, the faces of the rebels staring him down, all of it pressed on him with a weight he could not shake. A senior officer leaned toward him. "You understand the implications of what you saw, don't you?" he asked. Tyson nodded. "It's not just the prisoners," he said. "They're part of something bigger. They have contacts, routes, we only caught a glimpse of it." The officer frowned. "We have to assume everything we've seen is the tip of the iceberg. Every name, every safe house leads to more. We're already seeing activity in Pakistan, Yemen, even Europe. The ripple effect has started." Outside the embassy, the city hummed with tension. Afghan forces moved cautiously through the streets, aware that foreign eyes watched them. In the surrounding mountains, Northern Alliance patrols were already retracing the routes the surviving rebels had taken. The intelligence recovered from the uprising provided leads, but the network was vast, mobile, and unpredictable. By nightfall, a classified cable was sent directly to Washington. It was short, stark. Qala-i-Jangi uprising, multiple foreign nationals captured. Intelligence indicates extensive network. Immediate follow-up missions required. Prioritize safe houses and movement tracking. In response, a series of covert operations began to take shape. U.S. Special Forces were dispatched to remote areas where the recovered intelligence pointed: training camps, hideouts, logistical depots. Analysts worked round the clock to map out the network, attempting to predict its next move before it could regroup. Meanwhile, the surviving prisoners at Qala-i-Jangi were interrogated daily. Some provided crucial information, others lied, obfuscated, or remained silent. The young American, John Walker Lind, became a focal point of questions. Analysts wanted to understand his path, how a Western teenager had traveled to Afghanistan, what groups he had encountered, who had recruited him. His answers, fragmented and hesitant, hinted at an ideology that extended beyond borders, feeding a network that had already drawn the attention of multiple intelligence agencies. Even the simple act of cataloging prisoners' possessions revealed hidden links, encrypted notes, maps with safe house locations, coded instructions in diaries, and personal letters. Each fragment became a thread, and together they began to form a web that stretched far beyond Afghanistan's mountains. Tyson, exhausted but alert, realized something that others in the room did not yet see. The uprising at Qala-i-Jangi had not been merely a local event, it had been a spark. It exposed vulnerabilities in the network, yes, but it also activated the global chain reaction. Every captured name, every interrogated fighter, every recovered document had the potential to ignite new operations, new confrontations, and new battles in places the world had not yet imagined. The officers around him spoke in measured tones, planning raids, follow-ups, and surveillance missions. They discussed airstrikes, ground teams, and intelligence drops. But Tyson could see beyond the immediate logistics, he could see the human pattern behind the chaos. Networks, connections, loyalty, faith, and desperation intertwined in ways that no map could fully capture. By midnight, the city was quiet again. Kabul's streets glimmered with the distant lights of military vehicles. The fortress of Qala-i-Jangi was miles away, yet its shadow extended across borders, across continents. The uprising had ended, but its consequences had just begun. For Tyson and the intelligence community, the lesson was clear: the war had entered a new phase. No longer confined to the mountains, no longer limited to Afghanistan, it was now a global game of shadows, secrets, and deadly resolve. And in the quiet moments, long after the explosions had ceased, Tyson understood the hardest truth of all: the chain set in motion at Qala-i-Jangi would continue to move, long after anyone had left the fortress behind. The fortress was silent. The world would not be.